On today's World Insight, big test for COVID-19 vaccines in the pipeline. How far research on safety and efficacy has gone from the head of the International Vaccine Institute.
What will its real-world effectiveness be?
And Chinese cinema's road to recovery. Film industry insiders tell us how movie makers coped with the pandemic.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program with the latest on COVID-19 pandemic and the race for a vaccine or vaccines. With the fastest spreading global outbreak, no one is safe unless everyone is safe. This is the reason why the World Health Organization, WHO, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or known as CEPI, and the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, all led to create COVAX, the COVID-19 Vaccines Global Access. It is a world effort to develop, to make, and to equitably distribute a coronavirus vaccine or vaccines. Over 170 countries and vaccine researchers are engaged in COVAX, and today China said it signed up for the program. What is the significance of this decision? What are the prospects of global vaccine R&D and distribution? For answers, I talked to Jeremy Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. And I'm joined by Jeremy Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Dr. Kim, what a pleasure to see you once again.
It's always nice to see you again.
So many questions leading up to the end of the year regarding vaccine. Let me start by asking you, how much do you think COVAX would eventually function as many people wish it to be?
Well, I'm hoping, personally, that COVAX is fully functional. The world does need a certain level of supply of COVID-19 vaccines by the end of 2021. 20% is a minimum. Ideally, we would like to have more than that. So COVAX is not necessarily too big to fail, but it really should be considered too important to fail. So the participation of major powers around the world is really critical to its success.
There are two platforms it operates with. One is so-called a facility. The other is called MAC, if I remember right. So how does it work eventually for poor countries and rich countries alike?
So in the first phase of COVAX, countries should receive an amount of vaccine equal to roughly 20% of their need. And this would apply to wealthier countries as well as low and middle income countries. The first allocation, I think, will be 3%. That's been the current estimate of the need, and countries will need to prioritize. If at the end of 2021 there isn't sufficient supply, then COVAX will prioritize theoretically by country. Although again, I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to go on. And just to make the point that 150 countries, actually maybe even 170 countries now have signed expressions of interest. But really the devil will be in the details, as we say in English, that there are still lots of negotiations that have to occur in order to make COVAX a reality.
What kind of negotiations? In what kinds of details? How many devils do we have?
That's good. That's a great question. So I'm not party to any of those agreements, but every country will need to sign a series of agreements with COVAX in order to ensure that the vaccine will be supplied. I'm sure there are going to need to be agreements around the donation of funds for COVAX, because COVAX will be operating as a organization that requires commitment of funds and actually has to receive the funds from the nations that have committed funding. So, and then there are going to need to be agreements around receipt of vaccines and which vaccines. And so I think at least the countries that I'm aware of, the discussions are ongoing and they will be detailed. And we're in a global pandemic. The Gates Foundation has already estimated that if we don't have a mechanism for equitable distribution, that we could see twice the number of anticipated deaths globally. So we really need to get this mechanism fixed, and we really need the participation of global leaders.
China has committed, through the words of Chinese President Xi Jinping, that once a important vaccine comes into being that can be recognized by the world, then it will become a global public good. Now, what is the difference between China's commitment already being made to, let's just say, having the commitment and also join COVAX?
Yes, so the commitment is a very important first step. And there may even be more than one Chinese vaccine that eventually is WHO pre-qualified and would be eligible for participation in COVAX. So China has an important role to play. You know, the Chinese government commitment was an important first step. It would be important also to show solidarity with other countries in the world, which doesn't necessarily only include low and middle income countries. High-income countries have also volunteered to support the COVAX facility. So in this case, it's a joint commitment, global solidarity around the idea that COVID-19 vaccines, when they become available, need to be distributed with a view towards some equity.
How do you see China and United States, given your knowledge of the circle, working closely with CEPI, Gavi, certainly WHO, on the vaccine issue, have been approaching the possibility of joining? And what are the issues for both sides, I mean, for either of the country?
So I think certainly relationships between the two countries have been strained, and that's not an understatement at all. But really, as we approach global calamities, whether it's Ebola or COVID-19, I think that at least our best guess is that we work best when we work together. And when it is really something that threatens everybody, then everyone needs to pitch in and help. And this would apply whether it's something like COVID-19 or something that really affects us all, like global warming. I mean, these international solutions are going to be important for transnational problems. And I think that the one thing that this pandemic has shown is that infectious diseases remain a very important transnational problem for which transnational solutions, international agreements are going to be necessary in order to ensure that that vaccine solution, when it's available, is going to be available in the parts of the world that need it.
Do we know about herd immunity as to how much % of the population, once having vaccine, will make the world eventually having a herd immunity? Earlier, I've been talking to China CDC people. The number was not clear at the time when I talked to them, but there was suspicion about 60 to 70% for the COVID-19 virus. Now, what is your latest assessment?
If I were going to tell you the big questions the day after one company or another announces that it has a vaccine that is safe and efficacious, herd immunity would be one of the key questions, because we don't necessarily anticipate that all the vaccines are the same. So for instance, if this were if we didn't have a vaccine and all we had was a disease that was running through society, then the estimate is that, when roughly 60 to 70% of people are infected, then we would have herd immunity and the disease would begin to die out. And, there were countries, and Sweden would be one of them, that had initially thought that they would escape from COVID-19 by allowing the population to reach herd immunity naturally, and it resulted in a substantial number of deaths. Yeah. Vaccines offered the potential for herd immunity without the deaths, because vaccines, in essence, work by imitating a disease without making you sick. And the hope is that when we have a vaccine, that it will demonstrate the same kind of protection that natural infection does. But it's not necessarily guaranteed. And so one of the big questions that will come up after a company says, in a large trial, 30,000 people, 15,000 people got vaccine, 15,000 people got placebo. We followed them for 6 to 12 months. We followed them very closely, and yes, the vaccine has an efficacy of 60%. We're very proud, we're very happy, it's also safe, great. But the real question will be, now, when we take that vaccine and we're not in a clinical trial anymore, but we're vaccinating millions of people around the world, what will its real-world effectiveness be? And they could be different. So, as an example, the oral cholera vaccine that IVI helped to develop has an efficacy of 55%. But when you use that vaccine in an Indian city and vaccinate 50% of the population, the effectiveness is 85%. So the two are not necessarily directly related, but it gets to the real question of herd immunity. And that is going to be critical evidence to generate, and the vaccines may be different. So as we think about, now not 3 months from now, but now 6 and 9 months from now, we're really going to need to start generating evidence around effectiveness.
Which means even by the end of the 2021, with ideal situation as COVAX has planned out, we still would not have a relatively safe world. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes.
Okay.
So exactly. So as you pointed out, if vaccine is available, and if we have more than one vaccine, that's even better, we will reach the target faster. But the current target for COVAX will not take us near what we think we need for herd immunity to be established. It will be a few years before we reach the levels that we need in order to begin to assume that we have some sort of herd protection. But the other important question is, we didn't rush. We accelerated the process of vaccine development. So what would normally be a 5 to 10 year process was done in 12 to 18 months. So at the end of the day, we may have a vaccine that protects and is safe, but we will not have necessarily had time to optimize everything. So it could be that in subsequent studies, the day after efficacy, we're going to say, well, you know what? The immune responses at 6 months don't look so great. Maybe we're going to have to boost people. And then the question will be, so how much do we give? If a person got the Sinovac vaccine, could they get the CanSino vaccine as a boost? So we won't know the answers to those questions either. And, can you mix vaccines? Will all vaccines be the same?
Right.
These are kinds of questions. Optimizing the dose, the schedule for the boost, are all questions that need to be answered the day after. And, they're critically important. With effectiveness, with long-term safety, these are going to be the things that we need to look at 9 months from now, 2 years from now. And we'll still be working on getting rid of COVID at that time.
We have seen, for example, the latest FDA policy regarding vaccine candidates have been shifting somewhat towards stricter rules rather than earlier, relatively looser rules. So given where you are, how do you see the global policy shifting as we speak when we are entering in the 12-3 of at least 9 promising vaccines worldwide? And also, we are also entering into a stage in which people are becoming more suspicious about whether they should trust the rushed vaccine and a season of flu all at the same time.
So point number 1 is everyone should be vaccinated for the flu also, I think. But But you raised another very important question, and that gets to the emergency use policies. So the US FDA said, all right, so for us to issue emergency use authorization, you not only have to show that it's safe and effective to the time point where you looked, but we're not going to issue something until you can tell us, you can give us 2-month safety follow-up information after the last dose is received by the last participant in the trial. And that's taking a very conservative and some people would say a very correct view.
And also placebos being part of the numbers being supplied.
And placebos are part of the trials that we have going on now. So that's the U.S. emergency use policy. And other organizations like the EMA are undergoing what they call rolling reviews of data with the different companies. So will they apply a slightly different standard? Perhaps. Will they have the same requirement for 2 months of follow-up data on every subject? Again, perhaps, but perhaps not. Every country uses, or every organization uses a slightly different standard. But safety and efficacy are really key for emergency use, because really if the vaccine isn't safe and it has potentially unknown side effects that are manifest in the first 2 months after vaccination, better to have a volunteer under close scrutiny of a clinical trial than to have them, unmonitored.
We have seen the barometer of time, for example, in U.S. politics, regarding vaccine, have been so much related to the presidential candidates debate and also presidential candidates' policies so far. Now, you earlier talking about the COVAX platform and suggesting probably the deadline have to be postponed to another time next year. So how do you see the danger of politics having a relatively bigger say?
I think that we may have an answer on a safe and efficacious vaccine. Does one of the vaccines actually protect against infection or disease, and is it safe? Probably by November to December or maybe early January. So I think that timeline is correct. When will the supply? So probably in the U.S., maybe by mid-year next year, mid-2021, you'll start to see adequate levels of supply. Will COVAX be able to achieve its 2 billion doses by the end of 2021? That's the hope. Now, around the regulatory agencies, and again, you see the lure of vaccines, right? The U.S. is in the middle of one of the worst pandemics it's had for a century. 200,000 Americans have died. It's been difficult to impose a social solution or political solution the way China has, with mandatory wearing of masks and enforcement. So for them, a vaccine is luring, has a special need. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has always been, and it has as its mission, that the vaccines be safe and effective. And I think that the FDA's issuing of the guidance and finally the White House approval and or allowing it to be posted was very important, because now they've said, all politics aside, these are the requirements that we will follow. So in a sense, then, the correct procedure to ensure safety and efficacy is now the path forward.
Going into the flu season, though, Dr. Kim, many are worried because China, for example, have a huge populated society, and flu has always been a big problem. So, Dr. Kim, how do you see this part of the world? Because now we can't travel much, but rather only within the region of Northeast Asia, it seems, or within the country itself.
How will the COVID distancing and mask requirements impact the transmission of the flu? We don't know. South Africa had a very light flu season. Their seasons are reversed.
That's right.
So they got through their flu season, but they were also locked down. So they had an additional level of distancing caused by the lockdown. So it's difficult to know. The one advantage is that vaccine companies in Northeast Asia are able to make significant quantities of flu vaccine. And people in Northeast Asia, Japan, China, Korea, probably are people who follow government instructions to use and take vaccines. And so if the government recommendation is for vaccination, then people get vaccinated. If you understand how vaccines help, the idea of using the flu vaccine to keep people out of the hospital, because of the potential surge in COVID, we don't want to have two surges of, people infected with influenza and people infected with SARS-CoV-2, hitting the hospitals at the same time, because that could cause significant overcrowding and potentially people would be neglected. And we don't want that to happen either. So this is a part of planning and preparation. And, the countries that have done better have not only had more central control over pandemic response, but have also been very good at preparing.
We have seen a very interesting editorial coming out of New England Journal of Medicine, a medical journal that has been very key on science and not politics, suggesting that the magazine itself and its staff and many of its contributors have been firmly committing to a change of president inside one country. So how do you see these days the stances of scientists in a time when situations are really intense in terms of science versus politics?
Interesting question. So I think the most important thing for politicians to realize is that scientists vote also. But the amazing things that science has generated, I think are a tribute and have been benefiting people medically and in terms of everyday life. I mean, whether it's, cell phones or, the convenience or the cleanliness of battery-powered cars, or these vaccines that we have, or new surgical techniques, or new drugs that work wonders against cancers that when I started medical school we could do absolutely nothing about. I mean, these are all advances funded by research, funded by governments, and governments that base a lot of their decisions on data that are generated by scientists. So, I don't encourage people to vote one way or the other. They vote in terms of their interests. But science has been a good thing, and it's generated lots of intellectual property and revenue for companies and employees. They're high tech, they're green industries. So I'm a big science cheerleader. For the journal, the New England Journal, to take a position is a bit unusual. I do say, but in the end, we do need funding for science. We need for people to understand science, so we need to improve science education. We need to get more people involved in science. We need to train scientists to be better communicators, because it's one thing for me to talk about the immunogenicity of a vaccine and T cells and B cells, but if people don't understand what I'm saying, then it really doesn't help us at all. I mean, we need to be more persuasive, and sometimes we're locked in our labs and so focused on the work in front of us that we forget that science is contributing to society in a way that we can't measure. And we need to be active participants and advocate for science and explain to people why it's important and how it will protect them. And by doing that, then hopefully we raise not only the credibility of science, but we get more people to understand that what we're doing is not bad, but it has significant and very important and good consequences for countries that support science.
Dr. Kim, I'm so glad you're both working inside the lab and walking out of it talking to us. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. You're watching World Insight. Still to come on our program, China's film industry bouncing back. What helped breathe new life into cinema? After discussion next. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Now let's have a look at how the Chinese film industry breathed back to life. There are quite many movies screening during the National Day holiday in China, including blockbusters such as Leap, My People, My Homeland, Vanguard, and the highly anticipated animated movie Legend of Defecation. At the film studios in Hengdian and Qingdao, hundreds of film crews are back to work, and everything was as busy as before the pandemic. But without a doubt, the pandemic has brought inevitable changes to the industry. Streaming platforms have risen as fierce competitors to traditional cinemas, especially during the outbreak when many movies decided to cancel theater releases and debut online instead. So what are the long-term prospects of film industry, both financially and creatively? Has the viewers' habits irreversibly changed to a new normal? We're going to ask that question to our panels. For more on Chinese films during the National Day holiday, in New York, Joanna Cheng, intercultural film critic and filmmaker. In Beijing, Teng Jimeng, a freelance cultural commentator, professor of American culture in China. And also in Beijing, Han Hua, media and communication consultant. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our program. First of all, isn't that amazing that 800, the movie, has already earned a box office of $3 billion, becoming the biggest global movie in the world for this year so far, Professor Tang?
Yes, absolutely. And mainstream movies with this very patriotism as its theme has always worked wonders in this country and have been appealing to the audiences nationwide.
One could argue this is a new phenomenon, but if you look at the numbers, Joanna, of last year, 2019, and there's a movie called My People, My Country. It has an opening weekend box office of 101 million. That's also very impressive. So how do you see the general trend in a way that movies with patriotic themes tend to be earning a lot of attention in the market right now in China?
The patriotic theme has been a theme traditionally in Chinese cinematic history, but in today's political environment, it becomes particularly important. So all the people in China can unite as one to confront all difficulties that's probably ahead of them. So I think movie is playing a very critical role at this particular juncture in history, particularly in the relationship between China and the rest of the world.
Ms. Han, how do you see this interesting phenomenon?
There are two numbers to give you a brief picture after the pandemic. We don't know when it ends. But in the past, the Spring Festival office usually accounts for about 15% of the total revenue of the year. But this year, the COVID-19 outbreak right before the Chinese Spring Festival made this 15% of revenue into zero, which is estimated at $1 billion this year. Another figure is the closing of about 20% cinema in China as of July this year. So I think the movie performance, the box office performance of this 800s is also unprecedented given in this context.
It is, but when you see the box office is coming back somewhat, particularly likely during the National Day holiday, this is certainly a very interesting theme which you have just talked about, the patriotic theme of the movie, because there's another box office called Leap, or The Leap, which is talking about the Chinese women's volleyball team, which has always been a national hero starting from the 1980s. You could argue that it has been inspiration for generations of young Chinese during China's reform and opening up. Professor Tang, I'm sure you were impressed by their stories throughout the years, and this time finally a movie. And interestingly, once again, a patriotic theme.
It's not just because it contains this very patriotic theme, but also it contains this very kind of fighting spirit. Lots of people were talking about the women's volleyball team as a national icon, representing this very national spirit, the spirit of being industrious, the spirit of being diligent, hardworking, and perhaps fighting this uphill battle when things are not in your favor. And so in this case, the women's volleyball teams kind of being put up on the big screen represents this very coming back of the so-called 女排精神, the spirit of the volleyball team. And so I think it's natural that we have quite a variety of films now being screened in movie theaters, and sports film. I consider it some kind of entertaining sports film now coming back to the to the big screen and try to kind of make an imprint on this very cinema market.
If you think about it, Joanna, that the moviegoers in China, of course, tend to be the younger generation, and the fact that patriotic themed movies echo extremely well with this market and with this generation, it's an absolute interesting phenomenon, one could speak.
Well, I certainly think the movie you just mentioned, Leap, is a very timely one. It put women into the center stage, where we see the female volleyball players conquering their fears and conquering conquering all the difficulties that they surpassed over the 35 years, that their way going to the championship. But I really want to say, I did see the trailer. I was very impressed, actually shocked by the narration to open the trailer. It says, the American and the Japanese will not have a soft hand on us. So please get ready to strike. So I think it gives me a sense that this film is preparing for people for some kind of war, which I don't think it should happen, but it's likely. But I think it's just giving me a sense of like tension. So it is a very engaging film, I hope. but it really alerted me to feel and sense where we are geographically or geopolitically, where we are in this equilibrium of this world affair.
Right.
We are at a crossroad of humanity is at crossroads. Civilization is put on a test. The movie is just one symptom through which we can see the velocity of human progress.
It's an interesting point you just raised, Ms. Han.
I noticed the interesting change of the titles of this movie. First, from the Chinese volleyball team, women volleyball team, to striving for championship. I think it is very interesting to watch the movie in this context of the fight with pandemic, because China is certainly taking the lead during the fight with the pandemic. It is not calling itself a champion, but it is certainly is. And also China is also leading the way in economic recovery post the COVID-19 outbreak, and also in the vaccine development as well. So the movie itself, or the media and entertainment industry as a whole in China, is booming again, or trying to resuming their responsibility as well as the economic energy to echo the calling from the generation, also from the context of this whole world situation.
Basically, sports. I mean, volleyball team has been volleyball match, and it has always been a very competitive sports item, item in the past. And many would say sports has always been a peacetime war, and that's why you hear lots of battle cry, and that's kind of stuff to encourage the team members to be more engaging, and in a sense to encourage them to play the match in a very competitive fashion. And I mean, metaphorically, I think that we shall continue to live geopolitically in this current world, whether we have this very COVID-19 or perhaps some kind of conflicts of interest or trade wars. And so in this sense, this film must be seen in a historical context. I mean, one in the context back in the 1980s, which is also a very, very competitive age for the Chinese people, because it is the very opening decade of China's reform. All Chinese people are kind of competing and working hard in order to leave an imprint on the world arena. And secondly, I think it must be put in the context in terms of this very COVID-19, as Ms. Han has referred to, as well as this very geopolitical strife and conflict. And so my argument is that, yes, there could be a political reading of this film, but let's not, I mean, interpret the film purely from a kind of a geopolitical strife and that very context.
Okay. Well, another question I do have in mind is, as some of you have already beautifully illustrated about the impact of the pandemic on the film industry, not just in China, but also everywhere in the world. Joanna, I want to go to you about that. There were earlier reports from PricewaterhouseCoopers suggesting how much the market of China and the market of the United States, for example, will be listed as the most attractive movie markets in the world. We have seen some numbers suggesting that by the year 2024, something like that, the U.S. box office is likely to lead to 10 billion. That's going to be an industry as much as that. While that of China, according to the report, will be about 8.1 billion. In fact, contradictory to some of the earlier predictions of the Chinese market, might be exceeding that of the United States even this year. So we do not know, whether these numbers are reliable numbers, but certainly they could be off reference. The question is more about what does it mean when a market is becoming the largest and the second largest in the world? How much will it have an impact on the taste of the industry, on the rhetorics of the industry, on the storytelling of the industry, and on the development of different sectors of this industry. I think this is a very interesting and relevant question right now. Ms. Chang.
The competition between the United States and China in terms of movie market has just become very intense. It has been forecasted by many industry experts that China will become the world's #1 film market by 2020. But this pandemic just happened. It put the United States at its back seat. And I think China is probably going to thrive in this pandemic. And I think it's probably going to prove this prophecy, is probably going to be doing good. So it's very symptomatic of this competition between these two markets. It's actually the competition between these two world power. Here we are at the, again, at the crossroad of history. We're seeing from the movie industry, this two world power is wrestling with each other.
Professor Tang, you could almost tell from the illustration of Ms. Chang about the mentalities from the other side of the world toward China. How do you see the growth of the film market this year, and how will film industry globally and also in different markets adjust to that?
Well, once again, I think the Chinese cinema market has been very seriously battered by COVID-19, but then the rebound is also very, very impressive. The rebound actually finds its most expression in the in the work right now being kind of reinitiated. For example, according to this very statistic, I mean, almost like 100 crews are actually now being now starting to work in cinema locations all across the country. And so in this sense, I think that the rebound is very robust and is going to lead the world cinema market. And thematically wise, I think the world is also looking up to China in terms of presenting the most interesting, the most appealing themes. And for example, even Disney are also are kind of appealing to the Chinese cinema market and trying to sell the China-themed movies, and also co-production film like Frozen. Frozen has always been Disney's kind of iconic images and film productions. Now it also enters into this very co-production track. And so I think that this rebound is not just leading Chinese film market, but also the world cinema market in terms of production, in terms of film investment, and also film distribution in the world right now. And so I would say that the film market right now, which is rebounding and will continue to, in a sense, prospering into the next 2 or 3 years. Think about the the screen numbers right now. China actually has 70,000 screens, which tops the U.S., which exceeds that of the U.S. and tops being #1 in the world.
Ms. Han, you used to work for international, multinational media company, and I know you work on many film projects as well. Some successful, some not necessarily so at that time, given the circumstances. So what do you make of the evolvement of the environment for cooperation, and also the possibilities for China-foreign cooperation right now, whether it's about the capital, whether it's about the market, whether it's about the story, the staff, the filming venues, you name it?
I would like to see the cooperation down the road can be very comprehensive, not only in capital investment, but also in the production. From the whole value chain need to be worked together. So I would like to describe this kind of competition as well as the cooperation as competition in the film industry, in particular in the context of when the U.S.-China relations are suffering from the free fall. The only silver lining, in my opinion, would be in this media and entertainment industry if there is cooperation between the #1 market and the #2 market. But I'm not that optimistic as Professor Teng just described, because to be frank with you, I'm not optimistic because the movie theater business model is too simple and not innovative enough and already took a hit before the coronavirus pandemic. So many movie theaters were working very hard now in coming up with some new models, collaborating with real estate developers, not only in China, but also in the US, to add functions, membership or loyalty programs, etc. But let me ask you this question. What was your last time to a movie theater? Maybe because of 800 you went there, but you cannot. So the conclusion is that you cannot live without content, but you can certainly live without a movie theater. So having said this, I'm optimistic with other business models in the cooperation between the two markets. For example, the online advertising, the online subscription model, or the film industry player to work harder to interact with consumers from the both markets during the whole production process to generate income from day one, such as fans investments to merchandise sales, where we can learn a lot from US markets. They do a lot of successful stories in this merchandising sales as well.
Thank you so much for the three of you for being with us. Han Hua, Teng Jimeng, Joanna Cheng. Really appreciate it. All the best. Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to search World Insight, the name of the program, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.